but we wanted something for ourselves and for our children. And so we took a chance with our lives.
We marched up the steps with this circle of soldiers with bayonets drawn. And walking up the steps that day was probably one of the biggest feelings I've ever had. I figured I had finally cracked it.
My freedom is very much entangled with the freedom of every other man. So I'm fighting for my own freedom here.
Are you scared?
Yes, I'm very much afraid. Everyone here is.
In a 10-year period, in the 1950s and 1960s, America fought a second revolution. It was fought in the South by black people in white. It was fought in the streets, in churches, in courts, in schools. It was fought to make America be America for all its citizens. These were America's civil rights years.
I take it then that you are advocating Negroes in New York to stay out of these national change stories?
Oh, no, that's not true. I'm advocating that American citizens interested in democracy should stay out of change stories.
I have thought for a long time that Negroes should be allowed to sit at the counters where we are served downtown. This is just a part of many things that I think they should be allowed to do.
All the people of the South are in favor of segregation. And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, we are going to maintain segregated schools down in Dixie.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people.
Let's go out camera and go on.
It was better not being front of camera, it's a matter of facing yourself and then hide your blows. Go on.
There was a clear engagement between those who wished the fullness of their personalities to be met and those that would destroy us physically and psychologically. You do not walk away from that. This is what movement meant. Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from that. You continue to answer it.
David Fair. Finally,
how are you?
I am doing very, very well. Good to see you. Thank you so much. That's such short notice and so on. I extended the invitation and you obliged me. So I am so happy that you were able to join in for the podcast interview today.
No problem. I apologize. I have two big dogs who may interfere from time to time. I just want to apologize in advance for that.
Oh, and that's fine. But we're so happy to have you. And I see that. But let me begin officially before. Actually, I see that we went to the same school. We both went to University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and, little bit different periods, though.
Yes.
We're like 40 years apart, I think.
Oh yes, definitely. And we both work. Well, I have worked in child, youth, and family services, and of course, I see that you have worked at the highest level in child, youth, and family services in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Yes.
So I have to ask you a question. Do you consider yourself a neoliberal, or do you just study neoliberalism?
I just study. I study strategy. I wrote a book on neoliberalism, globalization, income inequality, poverty, and resistance. So it's more looking at strategy. And when people ask me about that, it gives me a great opportunity to talk about the dynamics of the global north and the global south, how income inequality and how poverty was created through social adjustment policies, and how those policies affect people of the global south and the diaspora. Yes, so it's just a strategy.
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
So
neoliberalism is not one of my favorite approaches to social issues, but
yeah, but that was part of my thesis at Penn, and but now I'm looking at power, position, and status, and how power uses strategies that poses problems for progress. That's what I. And I'm
all these minor issues you try to deal with. I don't understand.
Yes. Yes. But I'm so happy to have you, man. And I follow you, just so you know. I read your stuff. So I saw that you were interviewed by HBO yesterday. But let me begin officially. Welcome to the Neoliberal Round podcast, everyone. I am Ronaldo McKenzie, and today we have with us Mr. David Fair, who recently said on LinkedIn in a posting on LinkedIn, "I'm humbled to have been interviewed by a TV crew from HBO for the third series of Eyes on the Prize, the award-winning documentary series telling the stories of the civil rights movement in the US. The first two series were broadcasted in the 80s and covered up to 1985, and the new series will be broadcasted next year. And you said they will pick up from there. So now, but before I ask you about the new series, which is to come, which you may have probably seen it already. I'm not sure, but they're working on it, I presume.
Yeah.
But before I ask you, let me say welcome to the show, and I would love to learn a little bit about you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor. It's an honor to be with you. What would you like to know?
Well, a little bit about your involvement in the film, because at first I thought you were a producer, but then so I wasn't sure. So the first question I wanted to ask you is your involvement in the film, and how are you involved in the film? How are you involved?
Well, they're picking what HBO is doing with this new series is picking up where the previous series of Eyes on the Prize left off, which was 1985. And around that time, in the mid-1980s, was when the controversies around the AIDS epidemic were at their height. And in Philadelphia, unlike in other big cities like New York and San Francisco or even Miami, from the very beginning of the epidemic, the number of the people who were getting what at that time we didn't know what to call it, but what we would now call HIV disease, they were mostly gay white men, but there was a large number, a much higher percentage of people of color, especially African American people, who were being diagnosed with this disease in Philadelphia. And that led to a lot of controversy because in the mid 1980s, pretty much Reagan was president and he didn't give a damn about AIDS. And so the only work that was really being done to help people with AIDS and to prevent the spread of AIDS was being done in the gay white community, which had the resources to be able to do that.
Yes.
In Philadelphia, those of us who were involved, at that time I was working for a predominantly Black union called the Hospital Workers Union in Philadelphia. And so our members of the union, a lot of whom were gay people, were having resistance. We're putting up resistance to caring for people with AIDS because they didn't know whether they could catch the disease by emptying their trash can or transporting them to an operating room or whatever. And so early on, where I was sitting, I was one of the few white leaders of that union. I learned, being a gay white man myself, I knew a lot about AIDS, but I learned that there was a whole dynamic around how AIDS was playing out in the African American and Latino communities that the gay white community was ignorant of. And not only ignorant of, but really resistant to understanding because of the fear that if we started talking about the AIDS crisis as affecting more than gay white men, then there would be fewer resources for gay people and more resources for the non-gay people who were not white. And even though most of the AIDS cases then and now in the Black community are still among gay people, Anyway, there were major controversies around that at the time. And I was one of the loudest voices complaining about the racism, basically, of the white gay community and how it addressed AIDS, which I felt was my job because I was white. It's not, I've never believed that it's up to black people to solve the problem of racism. It's up to white people to solve the problem of racism. It's our problem. And that attracted a lot of attention. I got a lot of media attention, and somehow or another came to the attention of the HBO producers of this new series, who wanted to talk to me about what it was like at that time and to help them connect to people of color, especially who were involved in that advocacy in the mid 1980s and late 1980s. So that's how it all developed, that we got involved in this new video.
Right, and I think but you also, I think if I were to read you correctly, you said that the first installment of the series includes a segment on the struggle to combat AIDS and in the Black community and the resistance of the AIDS bureaucracy to the empowerment of people of color in the AIDS movement. And so that was quite interesting. So and of course, we're going to Eyes on the Prize for people who are not aware of Eyes on the Prize, the film or the series or the production. I wanted so I think you said the first two looks at the civil rights and segregation. Civil rights and segregation.
Yes.
And what's the time period for that one?
Right, and that went from the 19th century all the way up to 1985. Eyes on the Prize was mostly focused. There were two series. There were 2 seasons of Eyes on the Prize back in the late 80s. And the first series covered up till 1965, when the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress. The second series went from 1965 to 1985 and talked a lot more about the Black Power movement, about the race riots that were happening, especially in the late 1960s. And they also talked about the fact that the civil rights movement became both less popular as well as less effective after the 1960s and early 1970s, because the power structure basically learned that it could continue to hide, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, it could continue to cloak racist activities and racist business practices and racist real estate practices and all that kind of stuff. They could put it in a different context, whereas in the previous iteration of this stuff in the 60s and 50s, it was easy to make the distinction between fairness and not unfairness. By the 1970s, a conscious effort was being made by white politicians to feed into the grievance of white people who felt like Black people were getting all of the benefits of government and didn't have to work for them. I mean, it was a classic racist kind of attitude. And that's what the second series of Eyes on the Prize focused on. I don't know exactly how they're handling the new series. All I know about is the segment that they were filming in Philadelphia over the last few days. But I imagine that it's not going to cover from 1985 to George Floyd. It'll probably cover from 1985 to maybe the early 2000s, because they only have 6 episodes, I think, and they have to get a lot in. Yes.
Okay. And it's quite interesting that, one of the things that you just said, which I wanted to go back to was, which is very important, the issue of racism of the white gay community as it relates to how that affected HIV, AIDS, and care in towards African Americans. And when we think about discrimination and so on, And when we think about racism, usually people just think black and white. But here we are. You said white gay community. There was also within the gay community some level of racism, which may have. Okay, and
I mean, I think I've always thought of the white gay community in Philadelphia as being like a small southern town. It was like it's changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, but back in the day, the only people of color you ever saw in gay community organizations or gay community events or the gay bars or other kinds of institutions in the gay community, the only people of color you saw were those who had white lovers.
Yes.
You know, and they were not necessarily, and not all of them obviously, but they were not necessarily seeing themselves as activists for the black community because of the sexual preferences that they had. They also tended to be people of some means. You know, you had people. The only, you know, what struck me in the 80s as a gay activist was the only black people that the typical gay white man interacted with, besides those who happened to be well off and have well off black gay lovers, was young black gay people who were tussling, who were prostituting themselves, and were being patronized by white gay men. You know, in fact, we even had a situation that occurred in the 80s where we started a group called the Ehrman Center, which was a mental health center, created a group home for gay kids. And most of the gay kids that came into the group home were the ones who were homeless, and they were mostly African American. And the moment that program of the Ehrman Center was created, there was major pressure from the white gay community to close the Ehrman Center, because it was like, why are we spending our money on these young black kids? You know, there was just no recognition of how fundamentally racist the whole structure of the gay movement was in those days. I mean, that's changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, but and now the language at least has changed. I don't know that the racism has changed. We've gotten any better, but the language has changed certainly, and the political correctness is a lot stronger today than it ever was back then. But that was a major struggle for those of us who and you know, I was working at a predominantly black union, so it mattered to me in a way it didn't necessarily matter to other white people, because I belonged to a basically black community of healthcare workers, and that gave me a perspective I think that was different than the typical white person. And they're the ones who taught me that they weren't going to fix this problem for me. I had to go into the white gay community as a white gay man and try to solve this problem.
Okay. And, you know, and you said that the resistance of the AIDS bureaucracy. You said that the struggle to combat AIDS in the black community, and you talked about, and you mentioned this, the resistance of the AIDS bureaucracy to the empowerment of people of color. Now, so the question is, what do you mean by the resistance of the AIDS? What was the kind of the bureaucracy here?
Well, the bureaucracy initially was really, the bureaucracy was originally organizations created in the white gay community to combat AIDS, because there was no government response. So I'm not talking about government agencies initially. We're talking about the fact that the white gay community was getting decimated by AIDS and created its own organizations to help other white gay people who had AIDS. And there was no government money. I mean, today there's tens of millions of dollars being spent in Philadelphia to combat AIDS because government's involved. But before government was involved, all the money for services to combat AIDS had to come from gay people themselves. And that meant gay people who had the money to give. And that tended to be white gay people. And they created white gay organizations and created boards of directors of white gay organizations. And those white gay organizations had a predominantly white gay staff who understood the culture of the white gay community. The black gay community wasn't part of that community. The white gay community in Philadelphia was based in the Central City area, Center City, Philadelphia. And the black gay community was spread out throughout the black neighborhoods throughout the rest of the city. And they kept to themselves in the same way that gay white men kept to themselves. So when those of us, such as myself and a number of black activists, started organizing the black gay community around AIDS, that was very threatening to what I call, in that post, I called them the AIDS bureaucracy, because they were the only game in town. They were the only people doing anything about AIDS. You know, eventually, when government started to spend money on AIDS, we were able to direct some money to the minority organizations that were dealing with AIDS. But for most of the beginning, the first 10 years of the AIDS epidemic, there was no African-American presence, there was no Latino presence, there was no money being spent in those communities. And as a result, as time went on, the white gay proportion of people who had AIDS started to reduce, and the black and Latino proportion of people who had AIDS started to increase. And the black and Latino community that was getting AIDS was not just gay people. It was a lot of people who were drug addicts. It was a lot of people who were closeted, married men in the black community, especially, who were having sex on the side, gay sex on the side, but who were in denial about it and weren't telling their wives about it. And so suddenly we had all these women getting infected with AIDS because their husbands have been cheating on them with other men and spreading the disease to them. It was a much more complex epidemic in the black and Latino community than it was. Plus the cultural resistance for homosexuality in the black and Latino community was so much more severe. It was bad in the white community, but it was so much more severe in the black and Latino community. And you know, interestingly enough, during the 1980s, a guy named Wilson Goode was mayor of Philadelphia. He was the first black mayor of Philadelphia. And my union was very close to him. We had helped elect him mayor of Philadelphia. So that gave, and I had a great relationship with him, and a personal relationship with him. And so early on, I started harassing him. And I ran what was called Gay and Lesbian Friends of Wilson Goode to help him get elected 2 times. And so I harassed him unmercifully about the fact that city government wasn't doing anything about AIDS. And his response to me was the city was going bankrupt, which it was at the time, and that they didn't have the money to spend anything on AIDS. They needed to get the money from the federal government. And Ronald Reagan was president, and he was not spending a lot of money on AIDS. Reagan was in denial about AIDS, and his big priority was the drug war and the mass incarceration of African American people. So he wasn't worried about AIDS decimating communities within the black community. By 1987, things had gotten so bad in Philadelphia that he came to me and asked me if I would come into city government, leave the union, and come work for him in city government and create an AIDS office. And he gave me $9 million, what today would be $21 million. But at that time, it was $9 million. He gave me $9 million to create an AIDS program overnight. And in 8 months, we created a whole new bureaucracy, multiracial bureaucracy, with real money from the government that wasn't controlled by the white gay community. And we stood up a number of new organizations. Bibashi, which was a black AIDS organization, Congreso de Latinos Unidos, Galay, other organizations, Unity Philadelphia. These were all organizations in communities of color who cared about AIDS. And we were able to invest money in those organizations to stand them up quickly. And most of those programs still exist today, whereas most of the white gay AIDS communities disappeared a long time ago.
Wow, this is quite, and I'm in Philadelphia. I live in Philadelphia. I've been here for 13 years. And I understand the stigma that's associated with HIV/AIDS not just in Philadelphia, but almost all African American or Black and brown cultures in Jamaica. I'm from Jamaica. It is severe. Not only are they dealing with the stigma associated with being a homosexual, but also the stigma associated with HIV/AIDS and I think that's still a stigma, and that's still an issue in the Caribbean. But I wanted to ask you, and so you are instrumental in the kind of the organization and the efforts that's being done in Philadelphia. It started from your vision and your work and your push in the 1987, because prior to that, government was not as involved, and so you helped to spearhead this.
Yes, I helped. I mean, I don't want to sound like I did it all. There were plenty of other people involved. As you'll see when they do this video of Eyes on the Prize, there were a number of people that were interviewed. But I think when it came to the racial issues, I was one of the few white people, certainly, who was involved in that effort. And to be perfectly honest, I took advantage of my white privilege to be able to make things happen that other people couldn't make happen because they weren't white. And I think it was a good partnership that we should see more of in combating racism in the society.
That is so true. And, you hit the nail on the head in, talking about how can people use their privileges to bring about change. And, recently I commented on Michael Moore, who said he's going to give up he's threatened to give, maybe he said it jokingly, he's going to give up his citizenship because of the overturning of Roe. And I responded to Mr. Moore, actually. I responded to him and I said, well,